this presentation. So we've set out about 3 hours, but we might take a bit less depending on how it goes, how many questions, so don't worry. So the goal of this training, to recap, is pretty much to introduce the overarching Equitable Earth program, the structure, the certification journey that our certified projects go through, and any associated procedure. We also want to provide some sort of technical training on key procedures and requirements of both our program manual and our standard, which I will get to in the next slide or a couple of slides. And we want to make sure that there is alignment between VDB, so ANOR here, and Equitable Earth on quality expectations for validation and verifications. So just as a reminder, this is a training about introducing general concepts to get a sense of how we do things at Equitable Earth and how this might differ from other carbon crediting programs. But this still remains a high-level training on the concepts that we tackle. And then all the details are in the documentation on our website. So everything that I bring up here has a lot more requirements associated to them in the documentation on our website. So we work with an active participation model just to make sure that these sessions are not boring for everybody. So I have prepared some polls with questions. There's nothing tricky. They're basic questions about what I just said, just to keep this active. So I will launch the polls every time I have one, and you can answer. They're all single answer. There's no multiple answer. And you will see the results at the end. The names are not shown. It's just to, get a temperature check of the room. We also have Q&A. So if you have any questions, we have a Q&A section at the bottom, which I will get to here. So for those of you that are not familiar with Google Meet, so at the bottom right, you have an icon that allows you to access a Q&A. So you just click on this Q&A. You can leave your question in there, and then I will get to it at the end. I will show you how. So we also have the polls that I was just mentioning to you. It's in the same section. You will find all the polls that I have put as live, and you can answer the poll. As soon as I close it, you don't see the poll anymore, and then every new poll will appear in the same section. Q&A is there. So just to let you know, we have 2 parts. In each part, we have subsections. And at the end of every subsection, I have left time for questions. So you can either ask them live in this section, or you can leave them in the Q&A at all times during the presentation, and I will get to those questions when I get to this slide of Q&A at the end of every subsection. This is mainly to maintain the flow of the presentation, to not interrupt every single time. We have 2 options, either in the chat or live when I bring the questions slide. So just as a trial, we have a first poll, which is just to make sure that it works for everybody. So I will activate or launch the first poll. So it should be live for everyone. And you can just go ahead and click on the answer. I'm seeing some votes coming in. It's great. It seems like it's working. Yeah, 4 votes. You can also just, if you have any trouble accessing it, let me know either in the chat or by unmuting yourself. I'm seeing more answers coming in. 6 votes. I'll wait for a couple more seconds, but it seems like everybody's getting the hang of it.
So, real sorry, I'm not finding what you said. If you can come again. Sorry about that.
So at the bottom right of your screen, you should see multiple icons.
Yep.
This is the second to last. It's a bunch of dots in a square. It should say meeting tools. If you click on it, at the top, you have either tools or add-ons. When you go on tools, you have a bunch of things: speech translation, record polls, Q&A. and this is the poll section. Can you see it?
I don't think I have it.
If I may, Pablo, it appears in the top part of my screen. Maybe it's different for you.
Okay. Maybe it depends for different setups.
It doesn't look like it. No.
I'll send you a screenshot just in case.
Yes, please. Thank you. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah, I'll figure it out.
Perfect.
Sorry about that.
I'm getting 10 votes, so it seems like it's working. You all understand. So I can end the poll. There you go. And move forward. So as I was mentioning, this is the agenda for our presentation. In the first part, I will just be introducing Equitable Earth in general terms for all of you that are not fully familiar with it. Then I will go into certification journey and procedures, then tackle any procedures for project operational changes, and then any general requirements for our projects. We will then have about 10-minute break. And then in a part 2, I will get to all the validation verification specific requirements and processes that we have. So without further ado, I will jump into the introduction part. As most of you know, at Google Earth, we operate both a program manual and a standard, and then individual methodologies that fall under both documents. So all of our projects, all of our certified projects must be assessed against the program manual and the standard, regardless of the methodology applied. So we've been operating a first methodology, M001, that certifies terrestrial forest restoration. So this is typically an AR methodology. This is the first methodology that we had. We've now come to the third version of this methodology, updating it through the years. And as you all probably know, we have recently launched M002, which is the methodology for conservation projects, much like a RED+ methodology. And our standard is ICVCM accredited, so both the program manual and the standard. We are in the process of getting accreditation at the methodology level, and we're also built to align with CORSIA and ICRA requirements, yet to be endorsed. So just a few numbers. So we are now 30+ full-time staff. We're onboarding new people in this quarter. We have been in operations for about 5 years. We celebrated our 5th anniversary at the end of last year. And we have currently, this number changes quite fast, but we have about 1.65 million hectares in the pipeline, mixing both methodologies at this stage. And we actively work with these hectares are split between about 15 project developers that we work with. So as I was mentioning, this is just to show you a visual of the structure of our documentation. So we have both the program manual, which sets out overarching requirements about the certification procedures, MRV procedures, how our units work and their issuance, including registry procedures, any procedures for project operational changes, program management procedures, governance, and safeguards. So this is one document, and as you see in green, these are all the supporting procedures, which are standalone documents which come along the program manual. Again, this document is available on our website for you to consult. And then on the side, we also operate the Equitable Earth Standard, which details a bit more the principles and requirements that apply at the project level, for project design requirements, as much as the pillar level requirements. And then we have also provisions on SDGs and MRV. So these are the two overarching documentation. And then, as I was mentioning, there's additional requirements that are project type specific. So both for M001 and M002, which are separate documentation. So both of these documents set out all the eligibility criteria, methodology specific requirements per pillar, and then MRV requirements, as well as the whole quantification procedures for our projects. Are there any questions at this stage, just to also gauge if this works properly. I'm not seeing any in the Q&A, but feel free to use this Q&A feature at all times, or just unmute yourself if anything. You can also use the raise your hand function at the bottom. If there's nothing at this stage, I mean, I haven't said too much, so it should be normal. So now jumping into certification journey and procedures. So I will walk you through these steps, which are pretty much typical steps for VCM projects, nature-based projects, but we do certain things slightly differently compared to other carbon crediting programs. So I will walk you through these steps. So just as a general visual, we work with an initial phase with projects. So projects are submitted through our website with a project submission form. Developers first fill out a feasibility study, which is pretty much basic steps to assess that the project is feasible. If projects have had pre-submission activities before submission, they will also submit a pre-submission activities report, and alongside the feasibility report. So Equitable Earth does a first review of this feasibility report to make sure that the project can move on to the next stage, to the project design. At this feasibility stage, we will generate a first GHG removals and or reductions estimation, which will also get to inform the developers if they want to move forward with our certification. This is not something that needs to be assessed by the VVB. The VVB only assesses the project design through the PDD. So this is the second stage. If they've gone through the feasibility phase, they will move on to the project design phase, which will lead up to a PDD generation. This is quite typical. This PDD is first review. So what we do differently is that we first assess it. We do a first assessment of this PDD internally. And we generate, again, a net GHG removals or reduction estimation if the project has had pre-submission activities. If not, we only do a net GHG removal or reduction capacity for the project, so estimating the sequestration of the project for the entire crediting period. So then once the PDD and this estimation is generated, and we've done this first assessment, it goes to first public comment period, of course, and then to validation. I will get back to this, but if the project has declared pre-submission activities and wants to verify in tandem with validation, this is an option that we allow as well, although this is optional. I will get to this in the second part of the presentation. And then this is rather typical of the implementation phase of the project. So we have a 5-year cycle that goes on in loops. So we have in the year 1 to year 4, so projects just carry out implementation and monitoring. Every year we request an annual report from project developers. This is simply reviewed. This is reviewed for a check by Equitable Earth. It does not need to be assessed by the VVB. What is assessed is the monitoring report. So the monitoring report must be generated, must be submitted by the developer when they request verification. And the monitoring report is pretty much an aggregation of the annual reports since the previous verification. So when developers submit this monitoring report, this will also generate on our side the making of a quantification report, a GHG monitoring report, what we call. And then both of these reports, the monitoring report and the GHG monitoring report, must be verified by the VVB at verification. Every 5 years, the project needs to go through adaptive management. So this is to update the PDD, so I will get to this in more details, but so this leads to the generation of a monitoring report from the developer, as well as an updated PDD. Both of these need to be verified by the VVB as well. So knowing that these can also happen at the same time, a verification event and the adaptive management to streamline processes. This follows the preferred verification cycle by the developer. So now just jumping into more details into each of the steps. So during the feasibility phase, on Equitable Earth side, we carry out a typical KYC process. This is to determine the developer's technical capacity to carry out the project, as well as making sure that they comply with all legal requirements under their jurisdiction, as well as to assess the entity's overall legal and financial standing. What will come out of the step is a due diligence report. So this is a summary of our assessments and our checks. This report is published on the registry and at the end of the feasibility phase, and is available to the public for checking and assessment. This is the first part of the feasibility phase on our side. On the project side, as I was mentioning, developers must submit a feasibility study report. This is mainly to evaluate just the project area, the shapefiles, alongside the project, the land tenure of the project area, assessing if there's any legal obligations or applicability of any policies under the project's jurisdiction, making sure that there's no issues related to double counting, a preliminary stakeholder mapping and engagement plan, as well as a preliminary carbon sequestration estimation, as I was mentioning, to know if the developer wants to move forward with our certification. Once this is completed and assessed by us, projects can move on to the project design phase. So this is slightly different from other registries, although I think Vera also operates a project platform, but we mainly work through a certification platform to walk the developers through all the steps of the project journey. And so we ask developers to fill out design information and to submit supporting evidence in the certification platform, which we also call the web app. So this is a platform where they just connect, they log in at the beginning of the steps of the journey, and they fill out information through what we call surveys internally. So it's just, they're called survey by lack of a better term, but it's pretty much just forms internally where they have guidance on how to best fill out the information so that it complies with all the requirements. And then in this platform, a PDD is auto-generated. So we've done this mainly to reduce human error when the same information must be integrated through different parts of the PDD, and it must be changed in one section, but also across different sections. At least it's changed in the form, and then it's self-generated and the changes applies across the PDD. So this is how we've been working, also to make sure that design of PDDs are streamlined across all projects. So once this PDD is constantly generated. So when they fill out the information, it just adds constantly information to the PDD. And once the developer is done filling out all the information and has a completed preliminary PDD, as I was mentioning, Equitable Earth does a preliminary assessment. So we mainly assess for completeness of all the information, clarity and veracity, so that when it moves to VVB assessment and validation, we make sure it's already a clean version. So any discrepancies or lack of clarity will already lead to a first round of findings from Equitable Earth to make sure that, again, the PDD is clear. So once we've done this assessment, the project goes to a public comment period. This is quite typical. This is a 30-day period that is open on our website. Any stakeholders can leave feedback on the project based on the PDD and any supporting documentation that has been submitted on the registry. And once this period is closed, leads to the generation of a public comment digest aggregating all the feedback. And this document is also shared to the VVB alongside the rest of the documentation for the project. You'll see that I'm also putting visuals of these documentations so that you already have an idea of what they look like. I know it's quite small, you don't need to care about the content. This is just a visual to guide you through our reports. So once the public comment period is over, developers may request validation, and then Equitable Earth will mandate a VVB. We've already mentioned that in previous sessions. This is also something that we do slightly differently. The registry, so us, will mandate a VVB to perform audit services compared to the developer requesting the validation. So I will also get to this in more details on the criteria on how we select VVBs and how we assign VVBs per project. The objective of the validation, as you already know, is to review the project's PDD, assess the project conformance with all the requirements set out in the program manual, Equitable Earth standard, and the applied methodology, so M001 or M002 at this stage, and any new methodologies that will be developed in the future. So after validation, there's the typical, project implementation and monitoring by the developer. So since we do certain things for each project and the developer does all the project intervention, there's a dual monitoring happening by the developer and by us. So the developer must monitor indicators for all the project interventions, the risks, the safeguards, SDG contribution, any benefit sharing arrangements, if applicable, the project budget, loss events, and project deviations, if any have been granted. This is what must be monitored by the developer, and certain things must be monitored by Equitable Earth, since we generate the estimations, the GHG sequestration estimations. So we on our side will monitor all GHG parameters and AGB changes. We'll constantly monitor project area and leakage, as well as any loss events on a constant basis. In terms of reporting, I'm seeing that there's questions being asked. I will get to them at the end of this subsection. In terms of reporting, so developers must report annually through the annual reports, as I was mentioning in the visual at the beginning. So they must produce annual reports, which are assessed by us, by Equitable Earth. They do not need to be verified by the VDB on an annual basis. And then developers must report through the monitoring reports, which must report on all the monitored indicators that I was mentioning in this previous slide. And the first monitoring reports will include any reporting on any pre-submission activities, if applicable, for the project. In the years where developers request verification, the monitoring report replaces the annual report. And again, this monitoring report needs to be verified by the VVB. That's the report that is verified at verification. And the first annual report will cover the 12-month following the registration date of the project, and then it's an annual report from that date. This is just for additional context. On the other side, since Equitable Earth also monitors certain elements, we must also report on them. And so we generate also a GHG monitoring report at every verification. So since we're responsible for reporting the quantified results of net GHG reductions and or removals, since the previous verification period, we will generate a GHG monitoring report that covers this period since the previous verification. So this GHG monitoring report is typically included as an appendix to the monitoring report generated by the developer. And so this is what must be verified by the VGB. So both reports, knowing that they are integrated into one single PDF report. So this is for monitoring and reporting. For verification, so any Equitable Earth certified projects must undergo verification at least every 5 years. And then when within this time frame is based on the developer's decision according to their preferred verification schedule. They must simply request the verification event. The objective, again, much like the validation, you already know this information, but verification is to verify the information reported by developers in the monitoring report, any GHG statements reported by Equitable Earth in the GHG monitoring report, and to, again, assess the project's adherence to the initial PDD. And now for adaptive management, as I was mentioning, this must be done at least every 5 years from the project start date. And this means for the developer to update most of the PDD, and including the theory of change, which I will get to. We work with a theory of change model, the project objective and intervention, the project budget, the benefit sharing plan, if applicable, and any identified risks and any new risks that have been identified since the previous adaptive management. So this is it for the certification journey in general. I will go ahead with a second poll. I hope this was at least interesting. So I will launch it in the poll section. So the question is, what platform do we use to guide the developers through their certification journey? And that I was mentioning in this section. Again, you should be able to see the poll. It's a single answer again, so you only have one choice. I'm seeing some answers coming in. I will leave you a couple minutes to answer this poll. All right, so I'm getting a few votes. I'm seeing we're getting to about 10 votes. So answers are quite split between the certification platform or the web app and the Equitable Earth platform. So this is quite misleading. What we use is called the certification platform, or what we call the web app. Sometimes you'll see both terms. So it is developed by Equitable Earth. It is an internal app that we use. We don't outsource this app or anything. So we can also date it, and we make I'm admitting new people in the call. And so we make updates to this app based on developer feedback on the experience, based on VVB feedback of the experience. And so yes, so it is developed by us. However, it is what we call the certification platform or the web app. So thank you for answering. I will end this poll and move on to questions on this subsection on certification journey. I saw that there was a question left in the section. If findings are issued during the first Equitable Earth review, will the VVBs have access to these findings and their resolution? So thank you for the question. So typically we don't give access to those findings that have been raised during the certification process, simply because the findings that we raise is mainly, it's not so much in terms of content or in terms of well, sometimes it is in terms of content. It's mainly in terms of clarity of information, making sure that it will pass your assessment, the VVB's assessment, and making sure that based on our experience, this information or that information will not go to VVB, will not undergo pass through the VVB's assessment, or does not comply with our requirements, the way in which it's being declared or reported on. So the short answer is no, we don't typically give access to this. If there are any doubts or any questions from the VVB on any elements, this is typically something that we can ask. It's not something that's hidden. It's just something that we have not been used to making available. So yes. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions. You can always, this was really good. You can always put them in this Q&A section, and I'll get to them at the end. And if there's no additional ones, I will get to the next subsection. So this subsection is on procedures for project operational changes that has some sort of impact on validation and verification. So I will get to this part. So we will mainly tackle any project deviations, any expansions, any project transfers, as well as suspension and failure. For context, if you're more used to VCS or CCD terms, deviations is what is typically referred to as exemptions. So it's any deviations from requirements. So for deviations, internally, we have procedures for 3 different types of deviations from requirements. So we allow for methodology level deviations, standard deviations, and design deviations. You can consult the project documentation for more information, but deviations from certain types of requirements are not permitted. For example, eligibility criteria are not permitted to get deviations from, for obvious reasons. So any methodology or standard deviations, they occur when a project deviates or is at risk of deviating from a requirement, while design deviation occur when a project deviates from the last validated PDD. Methodology and design deviations can be temporary or permanent, while standard deviations must be temporary, as in we don't allow for permanent standard requirement deviations. In terms of procedures, so we still use this certification platform or the web app that I was just mentioning, and developers must submit deviation requests through the certification platform for the assessment of Equitable Earth. So again, each deviation request is assessed by our certification team. This is done on a case-by-case basis, and any decisions that are being made are not guaranteed to be precedent-setting. So every new request is newly assessed by the certification team. And of course, any decisions on deviations are shared to the VVB alongside the project documentation. So we only share positive or granted deviations. Any deviations that we have turned down are not shared because there's no justification that needs to be provided. It's just that it's either a critical requirement or it's just something that the developer just must comply with to move forward to the next stage. So this is for project deviations. As I was mentioning, we can also refer to them as exemptions if you are more used to this term. Simply that in our documentation, it's called a deviation. Now for project expansion. So generally speaking, Equitable Earth does not limit the frequency or the size of project expansions under the program manual, provided that, of course, additional areas that are being added are within the same jurisdiction and biomes as the originally certified project. Project expansion must conform to all applicable requirements, just like the rest of the project area. And keeping in mind that the expansion crediting area ends on the same date as the original project. This is more for developers to know, but this has implications on verification. So this is for you to be aware. In terms of the validation of these expansion areas, so they must be included in an updated PDD and must be validated by the VVB to be fully part of the project area. So before they're fully integrated. So this is for project expansion. In terms of project transfers, so this is something that we've newly added in the version 1.3 of our program manual and Equitable Earth standard. So now projects that are under development or registered with another carbon crediting program may transfer to Equitable Earth. This is mainly to answer a market demand of certain projects wanting to transition to Equitable Earth recently. So we have developed requirements for this to be a smooth process. So of course, these projects must comply with all the requirements set out in the program manual standard and the applied methodology. VVBs must assess these projects like any other Equitable Earth certified projects, taking into account all these additional requirements for transfer projects that we have set out in this new version of our program manual and standard. For suspension and failure, these are all pretty straightforward requirements on which we don't typically need to expand in this presentation, simply that this is part of the same section in the program manual, but you can find it in the documentation directly for more information, not to waste any time. So I will skip this slide. Again, leaving some space for questions. I am not seeing any in the Q&A, so I can move forward to the last part of last subsection of our part 1. This is the longest subsection of our section of the first part. So bear with me for this one, and after this subsection, we'll go into a break. So this is what I will be tackling in this subsection. So general requirements. So I will jump into our 3-pillar approach, what I was just mentioning at the beginning of the presentation. So since I was mentioning that as part of a 3-pillar approach, the livelihoods pillar that we have is at the standard level. So I will detail this one in more detail. And then the next 2 pillars, ecological condition and carbon, are detailed at the methodology level. So any information on that will be provided during the methodology trainings. I will then give you more information on GHG accounting and how we do that internally. Also the theory of change approach that I was quickly mentioning before. Any provisions on boundaries, the start date and crediting periods, carbon rights and land tenure for projects, pre-submission activities, the double counting provisions, any risk management, and units and their issuance with registry procedures. So first of all, for a 3-pillar approach. So all projects at Equitable Earth are assessed for their impacts across 3 pillars: ecological condition, which includes all biodiversity-related requirements, as well as ecological states of the project area; carbon, which includes all carbon sequestration and GHG statements, as well as livelihoods, so any community-related and stakeholder engagement requirements. So for each of these pillars, projects are required to establish a baseline scenario and then set interventions following a theory of change approach. So I mentioned the second part. Livelihoods-related requirements are methodology agnostic, so they all sit at the standard level, while provisions on ecological condition and carbon are further detailed at the methodology level. So I will take some time to explain some elements on the livelihoods pillar, which is something that we do slightly differently at Equitable Earth. So these are all the elements that I will be tackling in this subsection, if I may. So we first must establish some key concepts that we use either newly compared to other carbon crediting programs or slightly differently, and therefore must be defined. So just for your reference, all these terms and more terms are defined in the terms and definitions document that is on our website, but I will take the time to define groups is much like what is used in the BCS. So it's a group of individuals or individual stakeholders who derive similar income, livelihood, well-being, cultural values from the project, and who can be aggregated into groups that that have a unity. Stakeholders that have been identified as part of the project must belong to at least one stakeholder group, but can also belong to more than one. This is for stakeholder group. In terms of stakeholder engagement, so we differentiate stakeholder engagement from community consultation. Stakeholder engagement is the overarching concept, which is a process through which all the relevant project stakeholders must be actively informed about the project, which means project design and implementation. And this process must be tailored for each different stakeholder types, which I will get to in this term that you're seeing. Community consultation is more something that sits underneath or within stakeholder engagement, and this is a process that is specific to IPs and LCs, and a process through which developers must engage with IPs and LCs. So it's an active engagement process to share information, gather feedback, and incorporate any inputs into the project design and implementation for developers. So I will stick to this for the time being. In terms of project stakeholder type, we have integrated. So this is a further categorization or classification of stakeholder groups, which brings more detail on the relationship that they have with the project, such as their degree of influence, their interests, their rights, or how they're being affected by the project and its outcomes. So under the Equitable Earth standard, we have 4 different types. So we have core, direct, indirect, and other stakeholders. Core are any project stakeholders who hold rights over the project area. Direct stakeholders are any project stakeholders who are directly involved in the project but do not hold rights. Indirect are not directly affected and do not hold rights. And other stakeholders are any additional stakeholders that have some sort of influence that typically includes like investors, buyers, officials, academia, general public, anything external to the project that still has an influence. A core concept that we introduce is social additionality. This is something that we typically get questioned on because it's more sort of an academic term that we try to integrate and formalize into the project implementation. So this refers to any measurable social benefits resulting directly from project activities and that would not have occurred in the absence of those activities. So typically, like the general additionality concept is anything that would not have happened without the project, but specifically to social activities or livelihoods interventions. So this is mainly to make sure that all of our projects are not just focused on carbon, but also ecological condition and biodiversity, but mainly social additionality and community. So this is acknowledging that most projects are not solid without strong community buy-in on the project activities and its outcomes. And so projects must prove social additionality for certain stakeholders, which is all detailed in the standard documentation. The final term is co-design. So this is a collaborative decision-making process that integrates the needs and values and knowledge systems of some project stakeholders. And so the projects must be co-designed with certain project stakeholder types, which I will get to in the next slides. So as I was mentioning, collaborative decision-making process, and all of the projects must be co-designed with any core project stakeholders. So this is quite specific to Equitable Earth. If you recall, core project stakeholders are any stakeholders that hold rights over the project area. And so we believe that developers must co-design projects with those core project stakeholders. This includes the theory of change model, which spans the project objectives, outcomes, interventions, and targets. So this is making sure that projects are fully collaborative, mainly with IPs and LCs when identified as part of project stakeholders. in terms of the baseline assessment as part of the livelihoods pillar. So again, developers and core and direct project stakeholders must jointly establish the baseline scenario. This is making sure that the baseline scenario is solid and fully represents the conditions that are happening on the ground for the communities that are identified as project stakeholders. So we have some pre-identified categories or attributes, which spans livelihoods, cultural heritage and governance, as well as employment and wages for those communities that are part of the project area. And then we have brought additional flexibility in the new version of the standard for developers and identified stakeholder groups to jointly agree on more attributes to be assessed if relevant as part of the project's context. So following this baseline scenario and this baseline assessment, developers must prepare a livelihoods intervention plan, which is fully part of the theory of change model for the project. And developers must ensure that the intervention plan is designed to achieve social additionality for core and direct project stakeholders. So this is what I was mentioning. So measurable benefits for the communities that are identified as part of the project stakeholders based on the baseline scenario. So then there's typical monitoring of those indicators and metrics that must be done by the developer. Now jumping into some, so this is mainly for baseline assessment and intervention plan. A second part is stakeholder identification, stakeholder mapping, and classification. So this is quite typical, but developers must identify all the project stakeholders and define their role in the project and their rights to the project area. A requirement that we have as well is that developers must identify representatives for each identified stakeholder group. So then for each of those stakeholder groups, as part of the identification of their role, developers must classify those stakeholders through this classification that I was mentioning. So core, direct, indirect, and other. This is mainly identifying which of those stakeholders hold the rights over the land, which do not, but still have an influence or are directly impacted, which are influenced by the project but do not hold rights, and which are the other, including academia, media, officials, governments, etc. And of course, this classification has impacts on different engagement requirements. And so now jumping into the engagement of those stakeholders, so we have quite stringent or detailed requirements on stakeholder engagement. So meaning that developers must engage with all project stakeholders from an early stage. If you recall from the definition, so this is overarching engagement, meaning developer needing to inform all projects stakeholders about the project design and implementation, and allow for feedback from the project stakeholders. This engagement must be regular, ongoing, and transparent, and done through accessible and permanent communication channels with project stakeholders. We request developers as well to produce a stakeholder engagement plan, which must include all the stakeholders that must be engaged with, the engagement process that will be used, what will be shared with each stakeholders, what channels will be used, as well as the frequency and regularity of this engagement. This is to make sure that in the end, this engagement is ongoing, regular, and transparent. So then we have further requirements on engagements with IPs and LCs. Again, as you probably know, our requirements or our program manual and standard were co-developed with IPs and LCs from the Equitable Earth Coalition. So we have a strong interest and stake with integrating IPs and LCs into the project development and implementation, which is why we have detailed more specific and stringent requirements for projects with IPs and LCs. So the main two are the fact that it must be a participatory process and that a formal agreement must be signed. So when IPLCs and when IPs or LCs have been identified as part of the project stakeholders, all of the identification, mapping, communication, and engagement arrangements must be done in a participatory approach, meaning that it must be decided on in collaboration, in direct collaboration with the identified IPs and LCs. Developers are also requested to jointly establish a formal agreement that documents the consent for the project design and implementation as defined in the PDD. So this joint formal agreement must be signed between core project stakeholders and the developer. So core project stakeholders being all those IPs and LCs that hold rights over the project area. So making sure that there is consent for all the activities that are to come. All of this must be done following FPIC requirements. Of course, you're probably all familiar with FPIC, which is the free, prior, and informed consent process. So it's a specific right that pertains to IPs and LCs, and it's recognized by the United Nations, and it allows them to give or withhold consent to any projects that may affect them. As you're aware, FPIC applies to any kind of projects, not just to NBS projects on the VCM, simply that we make sure that this is central to our projects. It's a continuous process that allows IPs and LCs to conduct their own independent and collective discussions and decision-making. So free, prior, informed consent, this is just the definition of FPIC that you're aware of. Getting to the final stages on livelihoods. So we also have strong requirements on social safeguards. So these are just the concept that project must not harm any of the project stakeholder livelihoods and must deliver net positive livelihood benefits. This is what we call the social additionality, to bring back the terms into the discussion. And developers must identify if any project pose any potential risks related to those categories, which are basic livelihood categories. Again, further provisions are set out at the standard level. I won't get into the details on this. And then in terms of benefit sharing, so developers are requested to share benefits of the projects among relevant project stakeholders through a benefit sharing plan, which is appropriate to the project context and any applicable rules or regulations set out under the project's jurisdiction. Again, if any core project stakeholders have been identified, this plan must be co-designed with these stakeholders, and it must align with the interventions plan. Any benefit sharing arrangements which sit in the benefit sharing plan must be publicly accessible and disclosed in the annual reports and the monitoring reports, and therefore must be verified by the VVB. And this must be monitored, so making sure that developers distribute benefits according to the benefit sharing plan. So I know this is all quite bulky and a lot of information. Again, this is all recorded, and you can watch it at any point in time if you want to jump back into any of these sections, and then consult in parallel the Equitable Earth standards to jump further into each section. I will jump into another poll, which I will make live right away. Launch. So this poll is relating to the IPs and LC specific requirements, which I was just mentioning. And so this is the question: what elements must developers keep in mind when engaging with IPs and LCs, knowing again that this is a single answer process? So answers being participatory process, formal agreement with IPs and LCs, FPIC, or all of the above. Again, not meant to be tricky, quite straightforward. Seeing a few answers coming in. Thank you for answering. I think there is a common consensus on this one. It is indeed all of the above. So developers must engage with IPLCs in a participatory process through a formal agreement and following any FPIC requirements. FPIC can sit at the jurisdictional level, we have requirements set out in our standard, but there's also potentially additional FPIC requirements at the jurisdictional level, which developers must also follow. So I will end this poll. Thank you for all of the ones that have answered. And I will jump into the rest of the general requirements. So I didn't go point by point because this will go more smoothly, and we will get a break at the end of all of these points. So for the GHG accounting, again, this is something that, as I was mentioning, we do slightly differently to the extent that Equitable Earth has developed in-house algorithms based on satellite imagery to calculate GHG sequestration, whether it be removals or emission reduction. And to do that, so we have a strong what we call engineering team, which is split between a data team and a dev team internally to run these algorithms. And we leverage AGB data, raw AGB data from an external provider, which you probably or maybe know, called Chloris Geospatial. So we get this AGB data in raster format on the per project basis, and then we treat them in-house and then generate estimations based on the baseline scenario that has been determined by developers. So developers, as mentioning, will set out a baseline scenario based on the baseline assessment for each pillar, for the carbon pillar in this context. And then Equitable Earth will estimate the net GHG reduction or removal potential over the crediting period. So again, if any pre-submissions have been submitted, at validation, Equitable Earth will also generate a net GHG reduction or removal for the period that has passed since the beginning of activities. But typically we generate an estimation of the potential of the sequestration of the project for the crediting period. And so we do this internally to make sure that this is robust, that this is consistent across all projects, because the same methodology, the same quantification methodology is used for all projects. So making sure that there is consistency across the market, reducing human error, reducing error at the developer level. And also this is something that we built in using research and development. And so with time, with developing new features, new processes, making sure that it's more and more robust. And then for all projects at every verification, we calculate the GHG reduction or removal since the previous verification. And there's different quantification methodologies developed at the methodology level, of course, whether it be AR projects or RED+. And so this methodology is developed in the methodology documentation in the quantification part. So this is for GHG accounting. Now for theory of change, this is another general requirement for projects. So all projects, as I've been mentioning across different slides, must utilize a theory of change approach, making sure that we have a comprehensive and explicit approach for every project, which integrates objectives and outcomes, the project interventions, and then the indicators and metrics that will be used to assess the project. And so the process is that developers will first present the project context and the causal pathway, as well as the logic for this project, why the project exists, why it must be done, pretty much. This is done in collaboration with the baseline assessment. And then developers are required to define short-term targets, medium-term outcomes, and long-term objectives for the project, the assessment per pillar, and then based on all of the above, developers will develop an interventions plan, which will set out all the interventions to reach the objectives of the project. And then there's ongoing evaluation using the indicators and metrics that have been established at the beginning. So we, of course, provide templates and frameworks for developers to establish this and to fill out all the information smoothly, and that it generates into a readable, legible theory of change approach. This is integrated into the PDD, of course. Jumping into the boundaries of project. So this is a main concept for Equitable Earth, that we exclusively focus on the development of project-based activities, meaning that we do not permit for the development of programmatic jurisdictional policy sectoral approaches for crediting, like other carbon crediting programs do. We fully focus on project-based activities. For the shapefiles, so every project must, or developers for every project must submit shapefiles, which specifies the physical delineation and geographic boundaries of the project. And we differentiate mainly the project area and the crediting area. So project area is the general external boundaries of the projects where activities take place, which can be an aggregate of all the areas where interventions, operations, and project-related activities take place, including any exclusion zone, while the project crediting area is specifically the spatial extent activities directly contribute to emission reduction or removal. So that's where activities generate the units, the credits. So, and of course, the project crediting area must be integrated into the project area. So this is for boundaries. I am seeing that questions are coming in. Again, I have some space at the end to answer the questions. So for the start date and crediting period, so the start date is defined in our terminology, in our terms and definition document, as the date on which project activities are first implemented. So of course, this means that sometimes projects have an expected start date if activities have not yet started, and whether it is an expected started or an actual started, is specified in the PDD, because this has implication on the crediting period and validation and verification. It will be shown in the PDD if it's an actual start date or an expected start date. Under the Equitable Earth program, the crediting period is set at 40 years for both methodologies that we currently have. And this period may be renewed up to 3 times, meaning that a project's crediting period cannot exceed 100 years in total. I mean, we are talking about crazy time periods anyways, so this is not something to fuss about too much. Now, in terms of carbon rights and land tenure, so there's multiple options. What we require is that if land tenure is held directly by the developer, which is the case sometimes, developers must submit a valid property titles with evidence that the carbon rights are attached to the land under the project's jurisdiction. Sometimes it's not the case, as you may know. This is the first option. Second option is that if land tenure is not held by a third party, is not held by the developer, but by a third party, whether it be a community, whether it be the government, private individual, developers must demonstrate that they have exclusive and indisputable rights to operate over the land for the entire crediting period. And this must be done via a binding and enforceable agreement signed by all the rights holder. And there is the specific case where carbon rights and land rights are not attached under some project's jurisdiction. In this case, two different binding agreements must be signed. So again, these agreements must be checked by the VVB at validation. So this is to keep in mind. Now we're getting to the end of this section. Bear with me. For pre-submission activities. So I've been mentioning this term quite a few times. This is any activities that have been carried out by the projects before the developer submits it to Equitable Earth. So we only accept activities that have started within 3 years of the project, of the start of it, that have started 3 years before the project submission date, which is materialized by the project submission form. And so we don't accept any activities that have happened before that. And of course, for additionality concerns, developers must submit evidence showing that carbon credits were considered before as alternatives to funding. Any of these activities which have already happened must be reported on in the first monitoring report and assessed during the first verification, which can happen in tandem with validation or not, depending on the developer's preferred verification schedule. This is for pre-submission activities. Now for double counting requirements. So this is core CCP requirements. Double counting projects must not be actively registered with more than one carbon crediting program. So this is something that we check during the design review, and something that must be checked and assessed by the VVB as well. In case of previous registration of the project, developers must submit proof of withdrawal or deregistration during the certification phase. For transparency purposes, all units are serialized and registered publicly on the Equitable Earth registry, which is hosted by APX. And it features issuance, transfer, retirement, cancellation status, which is again quite typical. And to align with Article 6 of the Paris Agreements, Equitable Earth has developed a procedure to mitigate risk of double claims, which we have drafted a specific procedure for. I've linked it here. You can find it on our website in the supporting documentation again. In terms of risk assessment and risk management for at the project level, so Equitable Earth conducts a risk assessment. So internally at the certification stage, we conduct a first risk assessment and analyze any risks related to the delivery of the project, any risks of reversal, and any risk related to requirements or lack of compliance in the long term. So these are all risks that we have pre-identified, and it's the same set of risks for every project, but developers may include additional project-specific risks in this matrix. So once we assess these risks, we rate the risks based on the likelihood and the severity of the risks to happen. And based on this rating, on a per risk basis, developers must either monitor or mitigate the risks. So If they are low enough, they must monitor the risks on the long term. If they are high enough at project certification, they must mitigate them before the project is certified. All risks must be monitored and reported on annually as part of the annual report. And the entire risk assessment matrix is updated every 5 years as part of the adaptive management process. Getting to this last bit on units. So this is quite specific to Equitable Earth as well, and we have iterated through the years. You may sometimes see the term PRUs. This refers to project restoration units. This is something that we have phased out in version 1.1 of our program. These used to be ex ante units that could be traded and sold. Traded, sold, and exchanged by the VVB, by the developer once the project was validated to secure early stage financing. However, we have phased out this term and the concept and everything that goes with it. It still applies to projects that have been certified under version 1.1. So if you are to verify projects under 1.1, you might still see this term. More details can be found at the standard level. I don't think I need to take time to detail PRUs. Much like VRUs, so verified restoration units, is what we have been using up until version 1.2. So quite recently, we have changed this to ECUs, equitable carbon units, mainly because verified restoration units was quite specific and restricted to restoration projects, although with the expansion to RED Plus and conservation projects, it seemed more fair to update this term to ECUs, which is what we use now. So equitable carbon units are GHG statements, which are verified by a third party, the VVB, and they're issued at verification. These can be traded, sold, and exchanged, of course, according to our registry's term and conditions, and the Equitable Earth registry procedures and the anti-fraud policy. These are the actual units that can be retired, and they must be publicly disclosed in the registry, with accepted reasons being compensation or contribution for the buyers. I'm seeing that there's two of this slide. I am sorry. So this is it for units. I will now go into a few polls. There's 3 of them coming up, and then jump into any questions and the break. So let me open this poll, which is the fourth one that we have, which tackles anything that is unique about the GHG quantification of Equitable Earth certified projects. All the answers should be appearing on your screen. Again, only one answer is possible. Seeing I'm getting a few votes. Answers are split across 2 different ones. Mainly, Equitable Earth quantifies GHG removals and or reductions, and an external provider quantifies GHG removals and or reductions. The correct answer, which got the most votes, is the first one, Equitable Earth. The first one that I was mentioning. Equitable Earth does quantify GHG removals and or reductions. For the external provider, this is an external provider that we leverage AGB data from. So we get this AGB data for each project from Chloris Geospatial, but then we do quantify internally for any GHG removals and or reductions. I saw that there were questions popping up on this. I will get to them at the end of the polls. I will end this one and get to the next one. The next one being, does Equitable Earth permit the development of jurisdictional approaches for crediting? This is a yes or no question. It is quite straightforward. So this is in opposition to project-based activities that I was mentioning earlier in this slide. All right, getting quite a few votes. There's mainly a consensus. This is correct. It's no. Equitable Earth does not permit the development of jurisdictional approaches for crediting, but only project-based activities. Thank you for answering. And now a final poll. What is the length of the crediting period for Equitable Earth certified projects? You have 4 options. Again, only one correct answer. Getting quite a few votes. There's again pretty much a consensus on this one. Yeah, so most of you answered 40 years renewable. This is correct. This is correct. It's a 40-year crediting period for both of our methodologies, renewable by 20-year periods, up to 3 consecutive times. Great, so thank you for answering these polls. I will now get to questions. I saw that there were a few ones. I will answer them. I'll read them. Regarding GHG accounting, will these in-house algorithms and raw data be available for auditing, ad validation, and verification? So the algorithms themselves and the raw data is not available simply because this is something that we've developed. Well, at this stage, it is not. This is something that we are taking into consideration for future audits because we have received some questions about it. And so we are thinking about a way of sharing transparently how calculations are done and with what data. However, currently, since this is all rather large files, and again, raw data is the one that we pay for to the HGB provider, so it is at this stage confidential. We do not share it. However, in both the GHG baseline report that we generate that integrates the quantification, the sequestration potential, and in the GHG monitoring report, we have a whole section in the appendix that details the calculations. So what calculations and formula are being used, what numbers are being plugged into the formula, and then the results per category being what is the total sequestration, what are all the deductions that are being applied for all the adjustment factors being the buffer contribution, any leakage events, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is detailed. So, but we are in the process of also getting these in-house algorithms audited externally by an expert to make sure that it's not flawed or there's no errors in the code. But this is a great question. Thank you for raising it.
Yeah, thank you for answering. Yeah.
Okay, if there's additional question, don't hesitate. I understand that the VVB must also validate these GG calculations, or they must be accepted as valid. Correct. So as I was mentioning, so the calculations are all set out and detailed in the reports, in the GHG reports, whether it be the baseline or the monitoring reports, and these must be validated by the VVB. They shall not be accepted as valid from the get-go. From previous experience, we have received some comments on the calculation, which has led to clarification and corrections, which were all very pertinent findings. So by all means, those calculations must be validated by the VVB. If developers are allowed to provide an expected start date, does this mean that a project can be validated with an estimated start date? Correct. So the start date, it's typically so as part of the interventions plan, the developers will set an expected start date for the start of activities, and will detail that in the PDD. If projects activities have not started yet, they will set out an expected start date that must be validated by the VVB, and then the actual start date, if different from the expected one, must be updated in the first monitoring report, saying that project activity started on that date, making sure that the verification periods are set. And then this will be updated in the following PDD at adaptive management. But if this question is for verification periods, of course, it will be updated with the actual start date at the first verification. So yes, I think I have answered all questions. If there's any live ones, don't hesitate. If not, we now have a break of about 10 minutes, 10 to 15. Let's aim to trickle back in around 35, 40. So yeah, thank you for your attention. The second part will be a bit more smooth and less content heavy. So
Thank you.
for the attention. I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Validation and verification principles, processes, and documents and tools that we use and that we operate internally. So I will jump straight into the validation and verification principles with some general rules and reminding ISO principles and QMS requirements, and then some Equitable Earth specific requirements spanning validation, verification, remote audits and site visits provisions, VVB status, performance evaluation, and VVB sanction grounds. So some general rules. So all VVBs must be approved and onboarded by the Equitable Earth Secretariat to perform any audits. So we are in the final stages of doing this with ANOR. And once ANOR is approved, onboarded, and listed as active on the website, you will be able to perform audits. This is coming soon. As I was mentioning, for all project mandates, VVBs are selected by Equitable Earth and must report to both the Secretariat at Equitable Earth and the developer. And all validation verification must be performed in conformance with ISO 14064.3 and ISO 14065 requirements. And in this training, in the remainder of this training, I'll be providing details on program-specific requirements. Just to remind some ISO principles. So, of course, impartiality in the validation, verification, engagement, evidence-based. So, VVBs must employ a rational method for reaching reliable and reproducible conclusions, a fair presentation of information, including unresolved and diverging opinions among auditors. These are typical ISO requirements, ensuring that all the documentation establishes the basis for the conclusion and conformity with requirements, as well as conservativeness as a principle, using selection that is moderate when considering alternatives. Now, in terms of the quality management system, so according to ISO 17029, the VVB shall establish, document, implement, and maintain a management system to support and demonstrate the consistent achievements of the requirements in ISO 17029. This includes all the following elements. So policies and responsibilities in place regarding this QMS, top management periodic review of the QMS to ensure that it is suitable, adequate, and effective, as well as regular internal audits to ensure that the QMS conforms with the VVB requirements as well as ISO requirements, and that it is effectively implemented and maintained. Identification of any nonconformities in the VVB activities, the identification of any risks that might affect any of the validation verification activities, including conflicts of interest or biases, and then the maintaining and controlling documented information of all operations. These were just typical ISO principles and QMS reminders, which you are all fully aware of. And now in terms of the validations principles that are specific to Equitable Earth. So in terms of schedule, validation, I can answer this question quickly. The PowerPoint presentation is not shared at this stage, but we are recording the session. So I will be sharing the recording for you to proofread and jump back into any of the elements after the session. In terms of schedule, the validation must occur after the project design review by Equitable Earth and the public comment period, and once the developer requests validation. So I grayed out the remainder of this text box only because this is a requirement that we currently have under the current version of the validation verification procedure, but we are in the process of updating because we received feedback that this was not too realistic or feasible. So at this stage, validation must be completed within a 4-month period from the signature of the project mandate till the completion of the validation. This was a bit too stringent or a bit too short, so we are in the process of updating this requirement so that you are aware of it. In terms of the criteria, so this is again goes back to the goal of the validation is for the VVB to identify, assess, and address the potential any potential deviations from or non-conformance with the requirements that are set out in the program manual, the standard, and the applied methodology, and to assess the equations and parameters used in the GHG quantification. So these are the basic principles for validation. For verification, so again, same schedule that we have grayed out. Only other point is one that I have already mentioned, that verification must occur at least every 5 years following the developer's preferred schedule. The goal is again to identify, assess, and address potential deviations from or non-conformance with the criteria in the program documentation and the interventions defined in the PDD, as well as for the VVB to assess the equations and parameters used, like we were mentioning in the Q&A before the break. In terms of remote audits and site visits, so all audits under the Equitable Earth program can be done remotely. We have provisions for it. However, some site visits must be performed under some certain conditions, being an initial verification. So the first verification of a project must require a site visit. And then if project documentation is incomplete, if there are material grievances, complaints that have been filed since the last verification, if any stakeholders are not reachable or evidence is not accessible through remote channels, and if there's been any material changes in the scope or boundaries of reporting, this being a typical example being project expansion. And of course, again, in the end, it is the VVB's decision or not to perform a site visit. So if the VVB deems it necessary to assess some assertions made by the developer, a site visit must be done. If the VVB decides to perform a fully remote audit, they must first demonstrate that the project can be verified with reasonable level of assurance and or validated in accordance with the applicable validation requirements without performing a field visit. And any decision on remoteness of the audit or site visit must be communicated to the Secretariat and the developer through the mandate for all parties to be aware. In terms of the VVB status, so we have 3 possible status for VVBs, one being pending. So this is the current status of ANOR, meaning that you are undergoing the approval process for initial approval. If the VVB has been suspended and is in the process of reapproval, a pending status will also be applied. Once the VVB is approved or reapproved to perform validation or verification services, the VVB status is changed to active on the VVB on the Equitable Earth website, and is fully approved to perform audits under the Equitable Earth program. The inactive status will apply to any VVBs that are approved by the Equitable Earth process or have been approved but has undergone an unsuccessful performance evaluation and or is suspended, knowing that you can seek reapproval. So more details on the performance evaluation. So we typically carry out one after the first VVB's audit, whether it be a validation or a verification. And so this is the first one that we do. And then we carry out in-depth evaluation performances biannually, meaning every 2 years, to ensure that there's a consistent and ongoing performance assessment of the VVB's performance. And then we also reserve the right to carry out occasional performance evaluations when there's any sort of concerns or notification of concerns or complaints that arise regarding the VVB and its activities. So in terms of sanction grounds, there's 2 typical ones, either suspension of termination. Suspension results from any reasonable doubt of fraud allegation or deliberately misleading statements, as well as reasonable doubt that VVB procedures are not being followed. This may include, but is not limited to, any unannounced change to audit teams, negligence in preparation of some reports or audit techniques. This is very variable. And termination is if any of those allegations are confirmed, and if there's persistent issues with performance evaluation or inconsistency in quality of reports or any breach of applicable legislation, of course. So these are all the principles, the overarching principles. I will launch another poll. which relates to validation schedule, being at what stage must validation happen. Again, one answer possible. The PCP, of course, refers to the project, to the public comment period. Right. I'm seeing that most of you have answered, and you have all answered correctly for this one, actually. It is indeed after the project design review and the public comment period for the project. So thank you for answering. Now, questions on this subsection. I'm seeing that there was one added: site visit is not required at validation. So no, under our validation verification procedure, we do not require specifically a site visit at validation. It can be performed by the VVB at their discretion, provided that they schedule it in advance and let all parties know. But at validation, we consider that all elements can be done remotely, considering, of course, remote interviews with stakeholders, interviews with the developer, et cetera, et cetera. Most of our validated projects have been done remotely, except for a couple that had a joint validation verification, so a remote audit was required.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for this question. I'm not seeing any additional ones. In this case, I will jump to the second subsection of part 2, which refers to the actual process for validation and verification. So this is a 7-stage process, which again is quite typical from what is done on the market, with a few exceptions, which is why it's important to remind. Again, I've already made you aware of this, but Equitable Earth will select an approved VVB to perform the audit services. And the Secretariat will provide the VVB with all the necessary information to carry out the desk review. So to make a decision, first of all. So the project summary, the type of engagement, and the scope of engagement. And so the VVB must conduct a pre-engagement review, which is pretty much just reviewing the information that has been sent, and either accept or decline the mandate. And if it is accepted, the VVB must provide a provisional team composition with day rates for the developer's information for them to also sign off on the proposal. Just as a quick zoom on this VVB pre-engagement for you to know how we select VVBs for each mandate. So of course, the VVB must be approved as an eligibility criteria and listed as active, so not being inactive or pending. We also consider, of course, the availability of the VVB on the mentioned timeframe or the preferred timeframe by the developer. Also considering any of the audit team local knowledge, including, of course, any technical experts or third-party contractors. Also any day rates. This will be judged by or gauged by the developer based on their willingness or their means. And then we also consider any previous performance evaluations that have been carried out on the VVB. So once the VVB has been selected and has and has accepted the mandate. Or accepted the proposal. We go through a project mandate phase, which provides more details, which is pretty much like, there's different names for it, like the letter of engagement or just the contract for the project, which details the analysis, the team composition, process for evidence gathering activities, as well as final validation and or verification fees. And this engagement this mandate is cross-checked by Equitable Earth. And again, this is grayed out because at this stage, or up until now, we have been doing a tripartite signature of this project mandate between Equitable Earth, the developer, and the VVB. This is also something that we are reconsidering for direct signature between the VVB and the developer, which is what you're typically used to doing, if I'm not mistaken. So this again is pending the new version of the validation verification procedure. So once the project mandate is signed, all of this is quite typical. The validation and verification must be conducted following the project mandate with assessment of the GHG statements. And site visits can be performed if deemed necessary, as we mentioned, and must be performed following ISO requirements as well as internal requirements that we have in the validation verification procedure. Then a first opinion is being issued, evaluating material misstatements as well as conformity with all requirements. This is based on a validation report that we provide. I will show you what it looks like in the last part. And then the VVB must draft a first opinion. So in the corrective action plan, sorry, this is a wrong use of term, my bad, I'm just spotting this. This is referring to the non-conformity agreement, non-conformity reports. So we work with non-conformity reports for both the developer and Equitable Earth. This is also slightly different and directly stems from the fact that you're also assessing some of our work, being the GHG statements, the GHG claims. So we have a two-party or a two-tier non-conformity report system, and the VV must raise any project design related non-conformities to the developer and any quantification related questions to Equitable Earth, knowing that all parties or both parties have access to all non-conformities for transparency reasons. And for both non-conformity reports, we work with a typical CAR, clarification, forward action request system with, of course, project termination if there are too many blockers for the project, which we strive not to have, but this can happen. So non-conformities, what I was mentioning, we have two separate ones, two separate systems. Non-conformities, according to our requirements, must be responded to within 15 business days, either by us or by the developer. And if the response requires a system for monitoring its implementation, it must be established by the developer. So then responses typically, normal process must be assessed by the VVB. And then this process is reiterated for as many rounds as contractually indicated in the project mandate and or the letter of engagement. Technical review, this is done like you already, this is not, we don't do anything specific, must be reviewed by a technical reviewer, independent reviewer, and this must be done before the final opinion is issued. And this final opinion includes a conclusion with an opinion and modified or adverse based on the first opinion that's been raised. And then this validation or verification report is submitted on the certification platform, the same web app that we've been referring to throughout the presentation. and then it will be uploaded to the project's registry page by us. We allow for any changes to be made as well to the report, of course, but this must be communicated to Equitable Earth and to the developer under brief delays. So again, this is nothing too groundbreaking apart from the selection of the VVB by Equitable Earth, as well as this dual non-conformity report system, which stems directly from the fact that you also assess the work of Equitable Earth. Jumping into another poll, this is one of the last ones. So what I was just mentioning, which party is in charge of selecting a VVB for a project mandate? I'm launching it now. Yeah, I'm seeing most of you have answered. There's also quite a consensus that correct. Equitable Earth is in charge of selecting a VVB for a project mandate. So thank you for answering. I will close it and jump to questions. I'm seeing that there was one dropped in the Q&A section. How many rounds are acceptable? I assume rounds of non-conformities. This must be decided by, this is typically decided by the VVB and agreed on by the developer. From experience, we're seeing 2 to 3 rounds for most projects. This depends on the VVB internal procedures as well as the fees. More rounds typically leads to higher fees, less rounds to lower fees. So this is very much project dependent. If there's no other questions, we will be jumping into the final subsection of part 2, which is the last section of this presentation, relating to the validation and verification documents and also tools that we use for certification and validation and verification. And then we will be done slightly earlier than expected, which is great for everybody. So we'll mainly be tackling the certification platform, this one platform that I've been mentioning throughout this presentation, and then audit documents, both for validation and verification. So the Equitable Earth platform, or the web app again. So you can see a quick screenshot. Again, I know it's quite small, but this is just to give you an idea of what it looks like. There is a more in-depth training or more information about the certification platform when we mandate the first project. Since this is like intention, it must be mainly, it's easier when you have access to the platform, which we only grant after the trainings and once the VVB is active. So don't worry if you don't have all the information about the web app at this stage. There will be more coming at a later stage. So the certification platform, again, to remind you, is where developers can follow the step-by-step certification process through what we call a project journey. This is where all parties can have access to the supporting evidence and the VNV documentation in what we call an assets tab, and to have also access to the detailed field assessment surveys in the surveys tab. I will get to that in the next slides. We have dedicated accounts, the developers have dedicated accounts, and the VVB have dedicated accounts. It's an account per individual, per auditor. So once the VVB is approved and active, we will typically ask you for a list of all the auditors that have attended this training and have passed the test, to create a dedicated account per individual to access the web app. Each user has, of course, different permissions and different visibility rights. and this will be detailed at a later stage. Jumping point by point, so this is what I was mentioning by the developer certification journey. This is what it looks like, and these are all the steps that lead to the PDD generation. So these are all detailed steps that developer go step by step. They fill out what we call the surveys, which are all the elements that are underlined and in green, and they can mark each task as completed to walk them through the project steps, mainly to streamline the process and make it rather smooth. The VVB has access to all these steps to visualize what has been done. So this is the first tab, as you can see, the project journey here. And then we have an assets tab, which you can see at the top again, second tab. This has all the supporting evidence that the developer has submitted for our assessment and the VVB's assessment. It is split in different folders, including a supporting evidence report, which lists all the evidence that has been submitted by the developer and at what date it has been submitted, or the latest date at which it's been updated. This is for project journey and assets. At the bottom of the asset section, which is not showing here, I'm seeing it's a mistake. Below this, you can see all the validation and verification documentation, meaning the validation reports, the non-conformity reports, the project mandates, any documents that are relevant to the validation and or verification. I shall update this screenshot for the future. And then we have the surveys tab, which is again slightly specific to Equitable Earth. So for all of our projects, regardless of the methodology, developers are requested to conduct a field assessment to gather data for the baseline assessment and to monitor the performance of indicators, targets, outcomes, and objectives in the project area. And these field assessments are available through surveys in the web app and in the mobile app. So we have a mobile app for developers where they can fill out surveys on the ground. So the results of these surveys are accessible on the web app and are categorized by which survey and survey type has been filled out by the developer. And then it has a status if it's been not started, in progress, or completed. Once it reaches the validation stage, it should, of course, be fully validated. And then you can click on them and open all the answers and details. So this will depend on each project. So this is for the certification platform. So you have all the stages, again, for a reminder, the project journey, all the assets with all the documentation and all the surveys. You will get access through individual user credentials once the VVB is fully onboarded. Now, in terms of the audit documents, I will first detail the validation documents and then the verification documents. In terms of validation documents, so we have the PDD and the GHG baseline report that must be assessed by the developer, by the VVB. And then we make available validation reports to the VVB to make this assessment and to walk you through the assessment. So the PDD and the GHG baseline reports are the elements that must be assessed by the VVB. Validation report is to support this assessment. For the VVB first, so the VVB, we have a template, of course, that is made available on our website, and that details pretty much basic information for a nature-based solution project. So it has just general information about the project details, governance and management, stakeholders, including stakeholder mapping and engagement, details on pre-submission activities, the theory of change that I was mentioning, with targets, outcomes and objectives, as well as the interventions plan, then provisions on the GHG quantification, SDG contributions, the project safeguards, the risk assessment, the budget, and the MRV plan and schedule. And then there is space for appendix for any additional documentation or elements. So this is for the PDD. Any additional reports or documentation, not evidence, but reports or documentation that is submitted and must be assessed by the VVB is accessible through the registry. So this is just a screenshot of the of a typical project's registry page. This is for a project that has already been validated and verified or gone through a first verification. And so you will see that it has the project design document. It has, and then it has some additional documentation that have been submitted by the developer for assessment. Some of these are, this is a V1.1 project, so an old project. So some of these elements are no longer relevant, like this one, we don't have it anymore. Some of these we don't produce anymore, but this is just to give you an idea of what it looks like. It has the name of the document with a versioning, a date and a versioning to know which version of this document is and when it was submitted. It has the document type, and then it has also a version on the registry specifically. This is for PDD and supporting documentation. Now jumping to the GHG baseline report. So this is a report that we produce, again, Equitable Earth, at the project's validation. So as you probably remember, through the feasibility phase and design phase, we publish different versions of this GHG baseline reports based on how much information we have. So we have a pre-feasibility baseline report, a feasibility baseline report, and a final GHG baseline report, which we just call the GHG baseline report. Then this has all the information on the carbon stock, the GHG carbon stock, and the baseline estimation, as well as provision on any adjustment factors, which I was mentioning before. So any provisions on leakage, if it's already happened, on buffer pool contribution, and any additional adjustments that must be made. And this is where typically we detail the equations and the numbers that have been used to quantify the GHG statements. So this, again, must be assessed by the VVB alongside the PDD. And I was mentioning in the PDD, I'll go back, that it has a GHG quantification section. This is pretty much a summary of what is detailed in the GHG baseline report. So now going to the validation report. This is one that we produce, or a template that we make available to the VVB to navigate the VVB through the validation process. So it has different sections, an introduction section, validation process, the findings, and validation conclusion. Again, just for context, we make this available to make the process easy. This is not a mandatory one to use. If you have ones that you are used to using, which is understandable, you can use yours. We just think that ours is pre-made to facilitate the process, but up to you. So in the introduction, we just have the objective of the validation and the scope. The validation process has the methods, a space to detail the methods that have been used to validate the project, the audit team that has been part of the validation process. This is quite simple and straightforward. A space to detail all the documents that have been reviewed. Again, these refer to all the documents that I was referring to in the previous slide here. So all these documents, which one you have reviewed as part of this validation alongside the PDD. And and then a space for interviews. So any interviews that have been carried out between the VVB and the developer, and or with any communities or stakeholders, knowing that this is only a summary, and then any details about interviews are to be added to the appendix section. Site visits, again, if applicable, these are just a section to detail all the methods and objectives for any site visits that have been performed by the VVB. Sorry. And then a summary of the request, being the non-conformity requests. So we asked for a summary only to state pretty much the number of corrective action requests, clarification requests, and forward action requests that have been raised, and the typical process that have been used to resolve those findings. This is to align with ISO requirements on transparency and documentation. And then we request for the integration of the nonconformity reports as an appendix, so the full nonconformity reports as an appendix to the validation report. Now, this is the most interesting part for the validation findings. So we have a whole section for validation findings where we set out requirements and provisions per section for you to just have direct access to requirements per section to assess and to raise what assessment you've been doing and what conclusions you've made, and based on what reports and documents you've made those findings. So this is what it looks like. It's just a pre-filled section where it has the topic, the criteria to be assessed, the source of information, so where the developer has reported on these criteria for easy access, and then for you to fill out the means of assessment, any findings that have been raised as part of this assessment, and then the conclusion, if it's been validated or not. So this is what I was detailing, means of verification, findings, and conclusion. And then the final conclusion. So this includes a final opinion and a conclusion on the GHG calculations. And then the appendix, as I was mentioning, must include the nonconformity reports. This is what it looks like, and any interviews that have been carried out with developers or stakeholders. So this is it for the audit documents related to validation. Now, jumping to verification, I will take less time on this one, simply because we haven't produced or we haven't generated the templates for all of them at this stage. But the monitoring report is the one that I was mentioning to you in previous stages of this presentation. For a reminder, developers must submit on an annual basis annual reports, which are to be assessed by Equitable Earth only, not validated or verified by the developer, but they must consolidate some monitoring reports, which themselves must be validated, verified by the VVB. So before each verification, developers are requested to produce a monitoring report, which combines information from the annual reports of all the years since the previous verification. This must be assessed as part of the verification by the VVB, and this comes along with a GHG monitoring report. So before each verification, once the developer has produced the monitoring report, Equitable Earth will compile a GHG monitoring report, which consolidates all the net GHG reductions and or removals achieved during the previous verification period, so since the previous verification event. And this report contains so the project location, meaning all the project area and crediting area, all the net GHG reductions and removals that have been achieved from the monitoring of relevant GHG parameters, alongside the detailed calculations. Someone was asking this before. It also has all the detailed calculations and the numbers that have been used. And it also has a section on the GHG parameters that are monitored and the corresponding QA/QC for each parameter to ensure robustness of calculations and parameters used. So I think I've already said this, but the GHG monitoring report is added as, or is included as an appendix to the monitoring reports to make sure that this is one fully integrated report to be assessed by the VVB. So this is it for the monitoring report and the GHG monitoring report. Much like the validation report, we have a verification report. Again, this is just a report that is built to walk you through the verification steps and to smooth out the process. So that is pretty much it. Now another poll for you, which I will open, which tackles which documents must the VVB assess at verification, and I will launch it. This is the last poll that we have. Yes.
Hi, Corentin. Thank you so much. I must leave the session right now.
No problem.
Okay? Thank you so much for your time, and we will contact you in order to fix the next session. Okay?
Perfect. We're almost done anyway, so thank you for joining.
Thank you for your time and the explanations. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
It seems like most of you have answered, and it is a correct answer and consensus for all of you. It is both the monitoring report and the GHG monitoring report that must be assessed by the VVB at verification. Thank you for answering. And now we'll jump to last questions before we conclude the session and talk about next steps. I will check if there's any questions. I'm not seeing any additional questions that have been added. If we have none, so this is just a recap of what we've talked about. So just a quick introduction, the certification journey and associated procedures, any procedures for project operational changes, general project requirements, and then part 2 was dedicated to validation and verification requirements, processes, and documentation. And now in terms of the next step, so as Jose Luis was just mentioning, so we provide this session as a first session for the program manual and the standard, and then we dedicate methodology training, meaning that the next one will most likely be on M002 on terrestrial forest conservation, so for our RED+ methodology, simply because we will have an influx of projects coming in for which we will be mandating VVBs, including ANOR. So we will be scheduling this session rather soon in the next few weeks. To keep in mind, after these trainings, we have knowledge tests just to make sure that, again, those are not tricky. It's just to make sure to assess that all auditors have followed the trainings and are fully onboarded to carry out validation and verification on our projects. And once all the tests can be taken as many times as possible or as wanted until the the passing score is reached. And once it is reached, we issue individual certificates per auditors to just guarantee or to show completion of methodology trainings. So this is the bulk of the next steps. And as soon as all of this is done, we will go into contracting, final contracting. This only concerns the admin team and invoicing, and the listing finally of ANOR on our website as active. So you can already see that it has a pending status. As soon as the contract is finalized and trainings are finalized, we will be listing as active. And then this time frame can take as long as possible, depending on the influx of projects. And then as soon as we have a project that we can mandate or assign to ANOR, we will keep you posted and see if interests align. But thank you very much. We can, as previously mentioned, we can end a bit earlier. Thank you all for attending. It was a pleasure to deliver this training, and it was a lot of content. It was a lot of elements, but I will be sharing this recording with your team for you to review. You have access to all the documentation on our website to further dig into some elements. That's it. If you have any questions, do not hesitate. We have a bit of time for Q&A. If none, this is something that I haven't done, but I will leave my email in the chat for you to reach out. Most of you already have it, but if you don't, here it is. If you have any questions to send through, do not hesitate. And that's it. I will free you up for the rest of the day. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Quarantine. Have a good day.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Talk soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes.